everybody. Welcome to the podcast. It may interest you to know. I'm Toni Marcolini, and I've been planning and thinking and excited about this podcast for a really long time. My guest today, her name is Jamie Fiore Higgins, and you may know her from a book that came out not that long ago called Bully Market, a bestseller and a fantastic read. So I'm really excited to have her here today. Welcome, Jamie.
Hi, thank you so much for inviting me.
Well, I read your book, and for those who, this is not a surprise. Like for those who follow my podcast, they know I'm sort of an obsessive reader. So I'm constantly, I constantly have a book in my hand, and I read your book really fast because I thought it was just a great read, and I thought it also took incredible courage to write that book. And that's one of the reasons I wanted to talk to you. And let me throw it to you and say, can you give a short description of the book?
Sure. So my book is about my experience close to 20 years at Goldman Sachs. So I got my job offer at 21. I left in my 40s. And it wasn't until I left that I really kind of got interested in the dynamics at that place and how not only did it make it very hard for a woman and kind of other populations that are kind of the other in that organization that aren't in the glass offices, but not only that, Toni, but what I also perpetuated as well, the bad things I did in order to survive. And so I started writing about it, and really the goal was to shine a light on what really goes on in corporate America that nobody talks about, in order to inspire some conversation and like make some more inroads.
Well, that struck me, okay, about your book, because there is this just absolute like metamorphosis with you. Right? You start off, telling the story. You begin long before you get the job, for this kind of young, you know, ready to, young, newly educated, ready to take the world on, and find your place, a person to this metamorphosis as time goes on. Like you get changed in little bits and pieces as time goes on, as you learn to acclimate to your surroundings, and almost like a drowning person, you start giving up more and more. Like there's this fight in you early in the book, to not be sucked into this world, to this lifestyle, and it you slowly evolve, right? You slowly change and morph into the exact person you didn't want to be and you didn't like. And I was really struck by that, because I think that's also an important story to tell. I felt like you owned your mistakes, and I'm not gonna lie. I mean, you acknowledge in the book, like you made a lot of mistakes along the way, in this, and I thought it was such an important story to tell because you said, more or less, this could happen. Like, no matter how idealistic you may be, no matter what you think you can withstand, when put in the right setting, you can be sucked right into it. And it doesn't happen like a light switch. It happens in all these little ways that you turn away from.
Yeah. I feel like my character kind of slowly eroded over time. And it's so true, like the person I had wanted to be right out of college and like the person I became 20 years later were polar opposites.
Right. And that's why I was struck probably the most by that. I mean, obviously, the telling the story of what corporate America can be like is striking enough. I mean, and I do think those are important conversations to have, and it's great to shine a light on what's happening in the dark corners, uh, to try to get change to happen, meaningful change. And I think that's the only way that does happen, when people like you come forward. But I mean, I was equally struck by the parallel story being told, because it is your humanity. It's your personal journey into the abyss. And it
I mean,
doesn't happen like that. It
oh,
just
and I think
slowly.
it really shows you like what's at stake. Do you know? Yes, of course, you know, we know discrimination happens in the workplace. That's a very, I think, common experience. Certainly, I've seen since my book, it's a very common experience. And I know for me, being in a male dominated field, you know, I had to work twice as hard to get half as much. But I feel like all those things are more or less talked about. But what my book tried to address is the toll it takes on us as people. And my story is not that unique. Like, since I've written the book, I'm over 1,000 now of people who said, and men and women, have said, you know what, like, I bought into the culture and I didn't recognize myself anymore. And I feel like, although my experience isn't that unique, I feel that I'm unique because I put it out there on how that kind of being in that environment day after day, year after year takes its toll.
Right. I mean, and all the little ways that you don't see it, right? You don't see it. I mean, it happens gradually, in ways that, you know, you're not looking for, right? And you don't see, and people don't realize, no matter how protected you think you are, armor you think you're wearing in those settings, that you're morally going to stay, you're going to remain, you know, steadfast, that you are, not going to be sucked into this culture. It's not that easy, right? I mean, it's slowly, and that was, I thought, a really important part of your story, that metamorphosis. I thought, wow, this is something that people should be talking about even more, because you do start off one way and you change into somebody you don't even recognize, right? But by the time you're almost done, right, you kind of take ownership and say, what have I done? Like, you're standing amongst the ruins of you, of almost yourself and your character, you know, by the time you pull yourself out.
And it's fascinating because that parallel is it's a parallel to what I observed too. And, you know, even like my first day at the job, where, you know, the guys at the office were building an Excel spreadsheet ranking the women's breast size and leg length and ass shape and all this stuff. And I was like, just flabbergasted. And what I observed was, you know, when you're in an environment, Toni, any environment, and something happens that doesn't ring true to your values, what do? You usually look around like, did you just hear what I heard? Did you just see what I saw? And what I observed is everyone ignored it. Either they were part of it or they ignored it. And they're in their silence, they were almost complicit to it as well. And so you had this pattern where behavior was observed, it was ignored. And then what happens when you ignore behavior? It becomes normalized. And so I got these social cues from my environment. And you got to remember, I mean, I left the house. I live in suburban New Jersey. I left the house at 5:30 in the morning. And I used to get home by 8 or till 2 a.m., depending on the day. So most of my waking hours were in this bubble. And so I was constantly in that environment. And so that just being there, and also, I know it's an overused term, but the gaslighting was tremendous, because even early on, when I was like, that's really inappropriate, they'd be like, that's just the way it is here, Jamie. Like, that's how Wall Street rolls. And ironically, I came from a all women's college. So as you can imagine, it was all women, it was very pro women. You know, you were going to kind of go out there and change the world and fight for equality for women. But ironically, it kind of burned me, because the guys at work would say, you were brainwashed at that women's college. That's not how the real world operates. So it's not like I had gone to an institution with men and women that maybe I could have had a real example of what life could be like. And so that kind of also strengthened their argument that maybe I was crazy. Maybe this was just how Wall Street rolled.
There's an incident in your book, and I don't know if you're comfortable retelling it, but even when you were, after you had, I believe it was your first child, about breastfeeding
Mm,
and what you experienced. Do you
yeah.
mind sharing that? I know
Oh,
it's a
not at
little,
all.
yeah.
Well, the story actually begins earlier on when I had had my first children, twins. And, that's where I had always kind of experienced the dichotomy between what Goldman offered to its employees and what people really took advantage of, right? There always seemed to be like, oh yeah, we offer all these goodies, but you know what? You're not going to take it because then you'll look weak, kind of thing. I'll never forget after September 11th, they offered counseling services, but then everyone was afraid to go through that number because they were afraid it would be reported to the firm and then we would be viewed as weak and be
Yeah.
managed out. There was always that paranoia. But I'm getting ready to return to the office after I had my twins. And I got this pamphlet about like breastfeeding. And I really wanted to continue to pump milk for my daughters when I went back to the office. And it's like there was a whole rooms for it. They had 24-hour lactation consultants. Like they were really pushing
Supportive. The appearance of supportive.
appearance of support. So just like a week before I was due back, my boss called and said, "Oh, hey, I see you signed up for breastfeeding, using the lactation rooms." And I said yes. And he said, "Well, just so you know, if you want to make managing director," which was like the next step, he's like, "Managing directors don't go off the desk to pump. They're on the desk booking trades, like doing transactions, connecting with clients." So there was not only that, and it was also, if you go off the desk to pump, you're going to have to make the time later. So imagine you'll never see the girls when they're awake. And the whole thing was ridiculous, Toni, because the lactation rooms had computer access, phone access, right?
Yeah.
And on top of it, I can't tell you how many days those men would go off and get their shoes shined in the middle of the day. Like that was an appropriate thing. So I didn't breastfeed and I put them on formula and I went back to work. But finally, years later, when I had my fourth child and I knew I was leaving because of a bunch of things that had happened, I knew I was leaving. I said, you know what? I'm going to do it this time. Like, I'm going to do it. I don't care what they say. And so I signed up for those lactation rooms. I got all the parts that I had bought like 8 years before. I got them out of my basement. I cleaned them up to use on the machines. And I scheduled it on my calendar. My assistant knew about it. And I went up to go use the rooms, and my colleagues started getting up and mooing at me like a cow. And they
Yeah.
would put trinkets on my desk, milk cartons, stuffed cows. And so, I'm not surprised looking back why I didn't bother to begin with my first children. So it's like they offer these things and then they basically tell you on the download, don't use them. And then when you finally ever get to use them, you get punished.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's such an abusive culture, that really targeted women, um, to an abnormal degree. I mean, certainly women you know, are, are put in that situation in many more professions than yours. Um, but I mean, it almost feels like the men went out of their way. It wasn't just like the women they came across, that they weren't, that they were treating that way. It's almost like they got together and tried to come up with a plan. Like, I mean, the tales you tell in the book about what you were on the receiving end of, almost seem very calculating.
Yeah. And I mean, all the women, I talk about in the book how the men kind of categorized us in different ways. Like there'd be the woman who maybe like dressed a little more fashionably and maybe had more like, deeper cuts in the shirt or, and she would be like the sexy woman. And then there'd be like the woman who maybe would bake cookies over the weekend and bring them to the office. And she was the mom, and because I used to like blush when I heard all the ridiculous jokes and banner early on, they called me sister, the nun, so it was like, I was the prude, who was the mom, who was the slut. And it was like, it was just so ironic that they all were putting us into these buckets while they were able to enjoy their full identities all the time. And I would say it was women for sure. But also I talk in the book, like one of my friends at the office was a man, a white man, kind of looked like the guys in the office, but really wanted to see his kids at night, didn't want to go out to the strip clubs, didn't want to go out drinking. And he was marginalized too. So it really, yes, you could say it was a war on women. I mean, I am not a person of color, but I observed mistreatment of people of color. But I also think it was a war on anyone who didn't share the beliefs of the people in power. And for all I know, Tony, a lot of the guys I worked with who kind of contributed to that environment, they might have been just going along to get along too, because that's really what it was. It was like the guy in power who chose the bonuses, who decided on what you got paid, and if you had a job. He was almost like the Pied Piper, and you had to kind of appease him by
Right.
liking his likes.
Yeah, I mean, let's talk a little bit about the moment um it becomes clear to you what has happened. I mean, do you feel like that was a thunderbolt as much as it, or was it something that just because it's clear you're miserable, right? I mean,
That happened like almost from day one. I think, the big question is, well, why didn't you leave? Right. And so I had a lot of pressure from my family of origin. Like, my parents grew up with nothing, and the whole mantra for them is every generation has to do better. So it's like, hey, listen, like my mom and dad were the only ones of all their siblings, all their first cousins who went to college. So now it's like, okay, you guys have to do better. My brother was, an attorney. My sister's a pharmacist, professionals, graduate degrees. So it was like, okay, Jamie, what are you going to do? And I actually wanted to be a social worker because
yeah.
my childhood, I had a lot of health issues. I benefited from counseling and social workers. I wanted to do that. I wanted to like connect with people and make them feel good in their own skin and help them with depression and anxiety, etc. My parents are like, no way. Like, that's not going to make enough money. So even when my gut from day one was like, oh, this place is not in sync with my values, you know, my parents were so proud of me that like I got into Goldman Sachs knowing nobody. I mean, that was like unheard of. I know I wasn't the only one, but it was pretty special. So there was that kind of pressure going on. I'll never forget, my brother was like, when I was telling him I was miserable, he's like, it's not like they're beating you. Like, how bad could it be? You're making a ton of money, I'll take your job, and then on top of it, at Goldman, they would always say to you, you're so lucky to be here. It's harder to get here than it is to get into Harvard. So I kind of felt like I like hit the lottery, and I didn't want to lose the ticket because they made me feel, the people at Goldman made me feel that if I left, I would never accomplish anything else in my life. So that kind of pressure on both ends. And then you're making money. I mean, my first year, Tony, I made more than my parents ever did.
Oh,
So
and I mean, you're somewhat seduced by that
yeah,
a
and,
little bit as well.
the irony is, I'm not seduced in the way a lot of people might think. Like, my big joke was like, I showed up my first day with like a suit from TJ Maxx, shoes from Payless, and like a pleather purse from Marshalls. And I didn't even know what Louis Vuittons were. I didn't even know. I never bought into that because I saw the employees who are more senior than I buying into it, and then they were stuck. They like literally were they built these lifestyles like a monster that they had to keep working there to feed the machine. So for me, the money wasn't about spending it and being showy with it. It was about like safety, because my parents, so much of how we think about money is from our parents. Like, my parents never felt safe. They never felt secure. And so to me, I was able to give them security, me security, and that kind of security was valued over everything. So I was seduced by the money, but not in a way that most people would think. If anything, I almost am repulsed by material things because I associate it, which is wrong of me, but I associate it with like the crummy things people do to get the money.
Yeah. Yeah. And how, I mean, but you have to have a lightning bolt moment, right? For you, I mean, there has to be a moment in time that you are in that there's a just a reckoning,
I
right,
mean,
within yourself.
the lightning bolt real moment for me was when I almost lost my husband and my kids. That was
Yeah.
really like, I'd like to say I came to this conclusion and it was some sort of epiphany. It was really because my husband threatened me. And then I was like, so don't get me wrong. I constantly felt, you know, that what I was doing was not aligned with my values. But what I did was I made bad choices to cope with it. So
Yeah.
first it was like after September 11th, I started taking Xanax just to give me courage to get in the day. That started, being a once a day, every other day thing to like multiple times a day just to get through my day. I was drinking too much. I started a relationship with a guy I worked with. Like all these things were kind of, I can say this to you, Toni, maybe some of your listeners won't appreciate it, but it was like Calgon take me away moments. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? These short little bursts of escape to have me escape because I was just so miserable, but yet felt so obligated to keep staying to support my family of origin. And then PS, now I had kids to support. And
Yeah.
I was the primary breadwinner. And so finally, when my husband threatened to leave me, I was like, that was my reckoning. Like, I'm going to lose everything. Like, that was kind of a slap in the face. Like, Jamie, you can't have your cake and eat it too. You know what I mean? Like, you have to remember what's most important. And that was my reckoning to kind of get and the big joke was I was using all these things to escape Goldman in my mind. I just needed to escape Goldman with my body. And that was
Right.
the reckoning.
Because there is that, isn't there? I mean, as with all forms of escapism, you ultimately step back into the life you're living. Right. So, I mean, yes, you can escape with whatever your poison is, so to speak. You can escape with, but you're still having to step back to your life, to the life you're living. And unless you make active changes, they're never going to come to you. So, I mean, that's when you ultimately decide. But before we talk about the changes you've made in your life, if you could, with a magic wand, revise the system or the culture there, what advice, what would you put in place over in corporate America, in places, because certainly Goldman Sachs isn't unique or alone in that kind of rampant culture. It's probably true of most high-end corporate America establishments. So, what system would you put in place, do you think, that could make meaningful changes?
I think what could make meaningful changes is to stop thinking of these things as just soft things that aren't quantifiable and make them actually hard metrics. Like if Goldman Sachs sets its mind to increase market share in a region on a product, you better believe it happens or heads roll. Why don't they have the same goals around these topics? So like, for example, they always hire 50% women, but only less than 20% are in the partner track. What happens to them? They'll say it's because women leave to have kids. That's not really what the data says. The data says women leave workplaces because they have a lack of support. So it's like, why don't you identify these women early on in their career and give them real support, not BS, mentor programs where let's get real about it. And then let's track their careers and really see why they leave. And then when you find out, then create nets to capture them so they don't fall out. They have an HR department, which is great, but it's 40 floors up away from every business. If, when I was on the training desk, I sat right with my compliance officer, right? Because they wanted to make sure we weren't going to get fined by the SEC or go to jail. If they really, really cared about workplaces, why aren't people from HR sitting around? I think what corporate America needs is a little humility and curiosity. They're very much like, oh, we don't have a problem here. Not, this isn't happening in my house. We have all the things in the employee handbook, but they're meaningless. So to me, it's like, get some metrics and get people to care about this stuff as much as they care about P&L. You know, Goldman said a couple years ago that they wouldn't bring any companies to public unless they had at least one diverse member on the board. That's awesome. But are they looking inside and seeing what kind of hard, fast rules they can make around this stuff? And if people don't produce, hold them accountable. That's how you make it important. Heads have to roll. Bonuses have to be, on the line.
Yeah.
That's what corporations need to do.
Yeah. And that's really telling, because you do bring that point out in the book, right? I mean, because it's a facade. A lot of the things that are being offered, are the facade or the PR talking points for the company, as opposed to a culture that actually embraces those things.
Yeah. I
And
mean,
take
they feel like having the talking points is enough. My suggestion is you have to have action to prove those out. You can't just have a policy written. You need to have a structure in place to prove that you're doing those things.
so implementation is your
Yeah.
advice. You need to figure out better ways to implement, a policy that you're claiming.
And stakes have to be high enough.
Yeah.
It has to be tied to, and like, just like I knew if I didn't perform with my clients, I would pay either by losing my job or getting a lower bonus. You have to have the same stakes.
Yeah.
If
Yeah.
not, that it's just, it's a nice to have. This has to be a need to have.
Yeah. So let's talk about the backlash since you've written the book. There's been a fair amount,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So
No one likes a troublemaker, Toni.
right now, nobody likes somebody standing there with a flashlight, I found.
Nope. Nope.
So how have you reacted to the backlash? And what can you tell us about it?
So from Goldman, I've just gotten a canned response
Right.
that anytime anyone asks for their response, it's the same canned response. So that's that. The majority of the feedback has been good, meaning I get a lot of private messages that people feel seen and heard and supported. I've heard from like a half a dozen people who say like my book gave them the courage to look for another job, and not feel such a scarcity mindset around opportunity, and they've ended up landing in better places. But there have been a ton of naysayers, and some direct and some by their silence. So for example, about a week and a half before the book came out, the New York Post wrote an article about it. So I had to go to the Instagram page because those readers are tough. And I got a lot of, oh, too bad, so sad. She made a lot of money. Now she's writing a book about it. And I totally respect that. But I would argue, you know what? All the guys I worked with got paid 2-3 times as much as I did, with half the aggravation. And PS, because I had that half the aggravation, they're still there today. So like, where's the equity in that? Like, yes, on Wall Street, relatively, you make a lot of money, but there should be an absolute comparison too. And women make a lot less money on Wall Street than men. The other pushback that's been really, it surprised me, but then when I really think about it, am I shocked, is every positive response I get, for the most part, are private messages. People are very afraid to talk about this in public because they're afraid their mothership is looking at their comments. And listen, I get that, if you work at Goldman or you're a client of Goldman's, you might be a little worried about that. But what has really surprised me is, like, I've been invited to speak at women's affinity groups and then uninvited.
Yeah.
Because they're afraid of Goldman Sachs. So in some ways, I feel like people are trying to kind of cancel my message, which I wasn't surprised about Goldman or maybe Goldman clients, but like women's affinity groups are afraid to have me come. It's like, wow, it made me realize how far the tentacles of these companies who have a lot of power stretch. And that's been the most interesting thing at all. Some media outlets won't, because of, whose anchor summers with the CFO on the Hamptons in the summer, the drill. And so it almost reminds me of like a house of cards, that kind of enmeshed, embedded politics that keeps the truth from coming to the surface. But I love it, because I'm like, it just makes me want to just shoot my mouth off even more. But I didn't expect that much. But, I think that's what happens when you whistleblow, for lack of better words, on a big, powerful organization and name them.
Sure, but I think the standing in the shadows, which many people do, are exactly what they count on to help perpetuate the conduct, right? To help perpetuate the system remaining the same.
It's the
Yeah.
silence, right? Just like I said, the silence on the desk, it's the silence. So to me, I've had aggressive naysayers, but the most aggressive naysayers have been through their silence, People who I know with very large social media presence, whose message is all about my book, right? Have won't support the message because maybe they get paid by Goldman to speak every year, right?
Yeah.
Or maybe, one of the C-suite people go to their conference every year. So I guess for me, Toni, I feel so free that like nobody tells me what to do or say. Nobody has that hold over me except my family, right? And
Yeah.
these are super successful people, far more successful than I am, with far more money. And yet they're still prostrate to the Goldman gods, and other gods. And that's what I think is the most fascinating. It's like, wow, you're not free. I thought a lot of people who were free, I realized a lot of people who I thought were free to really be open and honest with their opinions are not free. And that's been shocking.
Yeah, and what I love, I think about your book too, is it really is, it's it's a symbol, to people who are in similar situations, or you can liken it to almost to any situation that is toxic.
Yeah.
Right. So, I mean, your workplace was definitely toxic. You started the ball rolling to having important conversations about that toxicity in that particular environment. But you can hold that comparison to many different fields. And if you in your life are experiencing toxicity in anything, the importance of figuring out a way to get yourself out.
Yeah.
Um, and I think really that's a beacon of light for that as well. You're telling a story where you say, "Hey, I get it." And there were a lot of benefits to enduring the toxicity, but still, I saw myself sinking, and I saved myself.
Yeah.
And you can do it too. And I think that,
Absolutely.
that's
And
also an important message.
yeah, and the irony is, Goldman had a real scarcity mindset around time, you know. Um, oh, you didn't make promotion this year, give it another year or two. Oh, bonuses are down this year, it'll even out in a couple years. Um, But really, that's not true. Time is the most scarce resource. They had this abundance mindset over time and a scarcity around money. And it's really opposite. You can make money anywhere, right? There is an abundance of jobs, but there's only so much time you have in life. And yes, I reaped a lot of goodies financially from Goldman, no doubt, but I also burned 20 years of my life. I mean, I got the job at 21. I left in my 40s. God willing, I'm still healthy. But what if I dropped dead the next day? That would have sucked. So
Right.
to me, it's like, I don't want to be frivolous with my time anymore. Like, I want to make my time count. And I want others, especially women, most of my coaching clients are women, to feel like empowered to do that too.
Yeah.
Because I feel like a lot of times we're in this negative cycle where we're almost Jedi minds effed,
Yeah.
into certain things. And I think you really need an outside person to allow people to see with clarity what's going on and what they really could do.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a great message, and such an important one. There are a lot of people who may have saved themselves, but wouldn't have thought to put a hand back, to save others. Also important, right? Because you get yourself out of that situation, and a lot of people would have said, "Okay, I got myself out. I've hit the reset button." But you do by shining that light, you're kind of putting your hand back saying, "And I'm gonna see what I can do about helping the ones that come after me."
That's right. And I wish, like, I think a lot about my 25, 27, 30-year-old self. Because at the end of the day, Tony, I left, and I made a good amount of money, but all those guys are still there making the money. And I know money isn't everything, but money is influence and power. We have to get more women. We have to get more people of color at the table,
Right,
because with power and money come influence. And so I have 3 daughters. I don't want anyone to rain on their parade from a
right.
career perspective. I want them to keep pushing and achieving and going. And no, could I have changed that? Well, I my biggest mistake was not having the support early on. Maybe I would have left, or maybe I would have stayed and had the confidence to assert myself more. Who
Right.
knows? Maybe
Yeah.
I would have the confidence to bring more women up. Maybe I would have the confidence to say, you know what, I'm not falling for your Jedi mind trick. I'm going to keep on pushing. I
Right.
don't know. I don't know how that would have ended because I didn't do that, but I sure as heck want to support people in the workplace now to kind of do the work. I don't
Yeah.
want them opting out of these careers. I mean, yes, if they really want to do something else, yes, but I don't want women to lose seats at these tables
Yeah.
because there's cascading effects in the economy.
Yeah. No, true. Let's talk about your change in careers, right? And I like to focus a lot on the podcast in the creative process, right? So you leave and ultimately make the decision to write this book. Um, and what does the creative process look like for you? In terms of, getting this together. I mean, did you have a process, beyond, because I've interviewed many authors who say, "Hey, I sat behind my computer. Like, once my fingers were on the keyboard, the story just went straight from my head, onto the on into the computer." And some people say, no, I had to plan an outline. I had to think everything out. Like, what did your creative process look like?
So first, once I decided that I should get this on paper, not knowing if I would even ever publish it, but just feeling the need to memorialize this on paper. I actually started with a poster board, and I kind of thought of like the big moments of my career, the kind of like, getting the job, what was at stake, coming up the ranks, and then eventually like almost losing my husband and kind of returning to myself, right? So I had all these post-its that signify those kind of, it's like the 3 act structure, right? Which
Right.
just naturally fit in my story. And then I would take one at a time, whichever one like had like was interesting to me, I would write about. I wouldn't think about doing in chronological order because did not know what I was doing. And so I said, well, I don't want to psych myself out by like starting at the beginning and maybe not wanting to write about something that I was comfortable writing at that point. So I did all that. And then once I had gotten enough and I decided I was really going to go through with it, like at that point, I still didn't know if I was going to write a book, but I had amassed something. And so I said to myself, I was really lucky. I was able to take a sabbatical from work. I had like an infant at the time, well, like a toddler. And so I said, what's a part-time job? And I said, a part-time job is probably around 20 hours a week, right? Half of a 40-hour work week. And I said to myself, I am going to hire myself to write 20 hours a week until this book is done. And I had a timesheet. I still have them, and it would be the kind of thing where I literally would get the clock on my laptop and, set it for 20 hours and then start and stop and start and stop. I would write 30 minutes in the car line at the elementary school because my little one would take a nap. I would write in the waiting room at the dance studio. I would write on the soccer field. Like I would write anytime. And I literally wrote this book in like 15 to 30-minute increments. And then I would count it all over. And then when Friday hit, I would see how much more I had to go. And my husband was very supportive. So some weekends I'd be like, listen, I have to really write a lot this week because I have to hit my 20 hours by Sunday night. And I just did that straight through. And after about a year and a half of really grinding, I finished the first draft.
And then when you put it together, it sounds like you wrote it in sections.
So I
And then
wrote it in sections. And then toward the end, I like, you know how it's like, Toni? I don't know if you crochet or knit. It's like granny squares. I
I
made,
don't.
okay. Do you know what a granny square is?
Yeah,
Right. So I literally, each piece was like a granny square. And
right.
at the end, I crocheted them all together to make the
Yeah,
blanket. But
yeah.
I would write a granny square here, and then a granny square there, and a granny square, and then I would put them in the granny square order and like sew them together. And so the last, 6 months of it was putting it all together, making sure it was coherent.
It absolutely is, because I can tell you from the reader's perspective, I could have never guessed that. There is an absolute flow
Yeah,
from the beginning to the end of the book. You don't at all feel like you're reading it in just highlights.
yeah,
And I as again, I'll mention it again, but I thought you really captured your evolution well. Right,
yeah,
because I felt like I knew who you were in the beginning. Right, like I felt like you could recognize who that person was and what she stood for, and then you just watch this change, and you see it happen, and you showed it in little bits and pieces. And I think that's one incredibly powerful tool that you used. And again, I know I mentioned this already, but I just think that so many people change in little pieces,
yeah.
right? It's never typically an overnight thing. Most people don't get to say, oh, I'm just gonna not do this ever again, and I'm just gonna. They don't change their lives, or they don't. It's rare that there's a big moment, that makes you
Crumbs,
just
usually.
like a light switch,
Breadcrumbs. Usually
right?
it's just breadcrumbs that, things that build and build and build over time.
Right. And things that what I found in your instance, because you're so, I'll use the word, you know, virtuous almost in the beginning.
I was,
Right. You seem to
I was so sweet. I was such a sweet girl.
right. And you seem to recognize um, the issues, or the offensiveness of the conduct in the beginning. Right. But as you become more absorbed, and I'd almost say numb, right? Because you get more and more numb to it as time goes on. Uh, that I really liked that. That's what you never could tell that it was written in sections, because the evolution is so um it's so clear to the reader, and it's like watching somebody drown. I mean, it's like you're watching and you're going, no, you want to scream at the book and be like, no, 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 like, just look
Yeah.
at that virtuous girl, what are you doing?
Well, I have to
Right.
say I give a lot. So I wrote the book on my own. So for those aspiring writers out there, if you want to write a nonfiction book, you actually don't have to finish it before you approach a publisher. I did, because I wasn't going to have the guts to go through with it unless I did it already. So that's why I was able to, once I signed with Simon and Schuster, I was able to like present the book within 4 months. Um, but that's because, so this is kind of an interesting tidbit. When I was interviewing with publishers, my agent was like, make sure you bring to the table some kind of more stories that aren't in the book. And so the night before some of my interviews, I went out to dinner with my husband, and I'm like, what, remember this, remember this? The whole scene I talk about in my assault, I had to put in the book. Just
Oh,
because in my mind, I didn't know how to introduce that character. Because when I combined characters, it made the narrative flow easier. So then my editor was like, okay, this is what I like, this is what I don't like. And so then I basically did a lot of cut and copying and pasting in those 4 months. And then my editor over 2 months was very, very good, because she would ask me, like, and this is one of the things that I was so concerned about. Like, I wanted people to be on my side on some level, to appreciate it. And so literally in the, I guess you call it the second draft, she was like, why don't you leave now? Why don't you leave now? 10 pages later, why don't you leave now? 20 pages later, for God's sake, Jamie, why don't you leave now? And I realized I hadn't really put in the ideas of identity and obligation I felt to my family, and how I had made Goldman like my God. You know, I cared about Goldman Sachs more than anybody else in my life, more than my parents, more than my husband, more than my children. And she just asked me these open-ended questions that really helped me breathe more life into it. And I think that's where a lot of like the deeper themes came in, because she challenged me.
Well, three cheers to editors, to all the
Yeah.
editors out there, right? Because I do think they bring out the best
Yeah. And so I had
in
so much
work.
more content, because she would ask me these questions and I would sit and ponder. And that helped because it was an outsider perspective.
Sure, sure. Yeah. So I mean, together, I always say that screenwriting is collaborative, in that you create a script and you create paper characters, and then actors come in and like they breathe life into the paper
Yeah.
characters, and then, cinematographers, directors, take you visually through the story. I mean, so, and then there's editors who put together the best cut. I think there's so many hands in that kind of creating. It's
Yeah.
very collaborative. But
Yeah.
often when we think of novelists of any kind, book writers, we don't think of collaboration. We tend to think of isolation. That person's in the corner writing their book, and they do it alone. But there is some collaboration in that creation, isn't there?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I love also what you say about screenwriting and that kind of cinematography with the scene and the visual. I really tried hard in my book to do that in words.
Right.
I wanted people to feel, taste, touch what I was feeling, tasting, and touching. Do you know what I mean? To kind
Yes.
of have that depth of explaining what the scenes look like, because I really felt that in order for someone to kind of really understand my journey, because again, I know there's just kind of natural pushback, too bad, so sad, whatever. Um, but I feel like if I created a body of work that allowed them to literally walk in my shoes, then maybe that kind of deeper understanding would happen, and not just kind of an on the surface judgment. I wanted it
Sure.
to be intimate, Toni. I wanted it to be like, I never met you before today. I wanted it to be like, I invited you for coffee. And I said, Toni, I want to tell you about my career at Goldman Sachs, and have that intimacy that I was kind of bearing my soul, right? Like two close friends over a cup of coffee. I want my readers to feel that intimacy with me. And the only way you do that is by telling the full story. So I always find it funny when people such as yourself will be like, I hope this isn't like too personal to go there. I always say, have you read my book? It's kind of too late for me to get personal, because to me, as was it Frost who said, no tears in the writer, no tears in the reader? You
Yeah.
have to be willing to like break your heart in order to break someone else's heart.
Sure. That's funny. You should say that. Sharon Gless was on the podcast not that
I
long
love
ago,
her. Oh
and
my gosh.
yeah. And I said that one of the things I loved best about her book, I said, it gave me that sensation like I was having a cup of tea with like an interesting person who had these really cool stories. So it's true, there is an element of that, right? You do want to feel sometimes like you're having this great conversation, especially with whether it be biographies, or some level of nonfiction that's a true story. It's really different than being, I mean, I love all types of books, really, except science fiction. That's the one thing genre I've never been able to be, uh, just I can't find a science fiction that interests me. But other than that, I mean, I like all pretty much all types of genres. And I think with nonfiction, that is really important. People have to be interested in your story. And that's a great way of putting it. Like the best for me nonfiction is when I feel like I could be having a cup of tea with that person and they're telling me this really cool story, and I'm like, no. Like
That
I
and
love
that
that.
I think that's a vulnerability. That's a choice you
Sure.
have to make if you're writing a memoir. And that's what novelists do with their characters. They show you the warts and all of their characters. And that's why novels are so great. The well done ones, because you feel like you see these characters warts and all. And that's a lot
Right.
easier to do as a novelist because it's all made up. Though I'm sure every novelist would say, real life and real people inspire some elements of, many of their characters and scenes. But that to me was necessary. I had read a lot of memoirs. I like you, I'm an avid reader, but I definitely read a lot of memoirs as I was writing my own. And the ones I liked the least I was like, I don't feel like they were really honest with me.
The
They didn't,
whitewashed
they
ones.
didn't give me the whole story. They
Yeah.
didn't give me the whole story. And to me, it's like, you got to tell the whole story. You might agree with it or not, but at least I know their truth. If not, why are, so to me, that really made me committed because I know I love the ones that showed more vulnerability than the ones that showed less. I didn't like as much.
Right. Yeah. I think to your credit, you don't go out of your way to paint yourself in a positive light in some portions of the book, right? And I think your willingness to accept um human frailty, right? Yeah, I mean, these were ways that I helped create my own destiny. And these were the mistakes I made, and I mean, not everybody would enjoy that, right?
Yeah.
Not everybody would enjoy taking people through the
Well,
tunnel of their life
I
and being
felt
like, oh, look how horrible I was here.
I had no right to write the book unless I did that.
Oh, there's no other way to tell the
No other
story
way.
without it. I agree. There's no other way. There's no other interesting way to tell the story without saying this is what I did, right? Because there is a certain element of that. There's a certain element of had you jumped off the ride at any point along the way, you don't get to how horrible it becomes,
Yeah.
right?
And there's
So I
something
think your editor was
freeing.
right in addressing those points, those moments.
Yeah, yeah. And there's something like, you know, like, with the book ends with me leaving, right? And if that was kind of me coming full circle, this book was almost another hero's journey. Because I was successful at Goldman. We've talked today a lot about the themes of silence. I always felt like I was muzzled. I couldn't say what I thought. I couldn't say what I saw. I couldn't say what I believed to be true. I had to kind of speak the party line, read from the script, do what, a good managing director at Goldman does. And so when I left, don't get me wrong, it was good for my family, good for my mental health. But putting this story forward in all its messiness and complications has been the ultimate freedom. Because I'm just saying what happened and I don't care what Goldman thinks of me. I used to
Yeah.
care only about what they thought of me. And now I could care less what they think of me because I know what happened and I'm going to tell about it. So that's why this book is almost like another hero's journey in my character, because I feel so comfortable in my own skin right now because I have nothing to hide anymore.
Yeah. Yeah. That's important. I mean, this is a really important story.
Yeah.
Um, so tell me, what lies ahead for you? What are you working on now? What are your career plans?
So I am coaching, which I really love. That's kind of my
Giving
way
back?
way of connecting with the Jamie Fiores of, 2002 through 2008 kind of person. And I actually went back to school and I'm pursuing a master's in social science. I'm learning a lot about organizations. Writing this book and made me really think about the psychology of organizations. And the responses from my readers have really showed me how much this is a universal problem. So I wanted to get my hands dirty with a little more on the academic side about, what really works in organizations to improve experience and outcomes, what doesn't. And so I'm really, really enjoying my coursework. And I'm writing. I'm not working on a project per se right now. I am writing. I'm teaching some writing classes, which I love. I'm helping people. I coach clients not only on kind of careers, but also on writing projects, and encouraging them, to be as authentic as possible. I know we talk a lot about authenticity and showing up as being authentic. That's like a very good line, living your true life, whatever, stepping into your truth. But I'm really interested in the how you do that. I know
Yeah.
we all want to do it, but I want to work with people on the how they can do that.
Yeah.
And then I have 4 kids at home, so being around for them, and yeah, and trying to drink 64 ounces of water each day. Another
Yeah,
goal.
you have a full you have a full life. I guess. Well, I mean, I look forward. I hope there's another book out there. I liked the way your style of writing. It did you absorbed me in, which is a little bit harder for nonfiction. Right? With fiction, I'm easily taken into the tale. And I could stick with a book for 10 hours, you know what I mean, to get to
So
the end. Again, if it's irresistible to me, that's my litmus test for a good novel. The irresistibility of it, like I can't put it down. I don't want to put it down. It's distracting me when I'm doing other things. Um, but it's very hard to find that with nonfiction, right? I thought that you did a great job with it of giving people that impulse of wanting to get back to your story. Um and and I so I hope that there is another book somewhere on the horizon. And so I'll just put that out there.
thank you. That means a lot. That's a great vote of confidence. So you never know. I will say in my Goldman life, I was so tunnel visioned because they made me feel like there was just like not a lot of opportunity. Like you just had to do your job every day. And so now it's so nice to be open, and this book, even just writing this book has allowed me so many opportunities and meeting so many cool people like you that I never would have had the opportunity to meet. So I'm always kind of back at Goldman, I was just tunnel visioned, only focused on the one thing. Now I kind of keep my eyes and ears open to anything. Like, who would have thought I'd be teaching classes and writing? Who would have thought I would have been in graduate school? And it sounds a little bit woo woo, but I feel like it's amazing when you kind of stop doing all the time, spend a little more time thinking and being open. And it's amazing what like comes up
Yeah.
given that opportunity.
Well,
So I
I'm gonna.
have my ears, my like universe ears up to see what's next.
Well, thank you. I know I went a little bit over, so I want to thank you for staying and to the end with me. And thank you for joining me today. Really, I loved your book. Again, an important story. Anybody who hasn't read it, you should definitely check this book out. It's well written. It's an easy read, and it'll suck you in and open your eyes. And again, I said this earlier on, but if you're experiencing any level of toxicity in your life, um, this is a good roadmap. You know, you can recognize it no matter how far you feel you've fallen into the abyss. You can pull your way out, and uh, it's really an important read in that regard. So if you're feeling that, again, I encourage you to pick up the book, or anyone. It's a great book.
Thank,
Thank you, Jamie, for joining me.
thank you for having me. It was a lot of fun.
And I'm going to close out the podcast and say, have a great day.